The views expressed on the following program are not necessarily those of WPSL. But you're encouraged to like and share them on Facebook because it's time now for the African American Scene, brought to you by Howard Insurance in Port St. Lucie and hosted by Rudy Howard.
Good evening, good evening, good evening. Always glad to be with you here on a Wednesday night. I'm going to disappoint some of you because I know you're wired up and ready to have at it on politics, but no politics tonight. I have a guest, and you know it's funny. This Facebook thing is really powerful. I have been communicating with this beautiful young lady for about 2 years on Facebook, and we struck up a really good friendship. And I think she's a really super nice lady. And I was inspired by that story on 60 Minutes about how difficult it was for people to come here who are coming from over in some of the Arabic countries. And I wanted to do a story on that. And so I reached out to her, and she was kind enough to say yes. And her name is Salima Abduki, and she can correct me when she comes on here. She's listening now. And let me tell you a little bit about her. She has an American mother. Her father is Syrian. And her mother and her father met in Aleppo. Her mother was in the Peace Corps, and that's how she met her father. She was born in Ithaca, New York, and traveled to several countries and was baptized in Beirut, Lebanon. And she has 3 adult children. And then I found out something else about her tonight that I never knew. She went to high school with my good friend, Doug Coward. Now, that really makes me understand why we hit it off so well. So Salima, say hello to my audience.
How are you doing, audience? Very nice to meet you, Rudy. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I appreciate that.
Yes, I appreciate you taking the time. Salima actually lives in the Panhandle, so she had to make special arrangements so that she would be available for me tonight. So
I was happy to do it.
Yeah. So, Salima, part of what I want you to do, I'm prone to educating my audience. I love to do that. It's part of the allure of my show is I like to give people information they're not normally going to get, and they're going to get plenty of it tonight from you. Tell us, Salima, what exactly is your religion?
I am actually Syrian Orthodox. Ironically, while I understood the worship and the practice of my faith, I didn't know much about the history until I was in college and took comparative religion. And when it came time to write about a religion that we had chosen, I chose to actually learn more about my own. And it was during that time that I was writing that paper that I discovered that the Syrian Orthodoxy was actually the first Christian faith practiced after the crucifixion of Christ, when St. Peter went to Antioch and held the very first Mass. So that was news to me, but it made sense since we are talking about Jesus having been from the Middle East, that the Syrian Orthodoxy would be one of the first faiths to emerge from the Middle East.
Now, see, that's an important piece of information because I will bet you most of my audience was not even aware that there was a Christian population in Syria, and that's really good. Now, you still have family over in Syria, in Aleppo in particular. Is that correct?
I have family that was able to flee Aleppo several years ago. I have the majority of my family now is in Homs and Hasakeh and Damascus. The vast majority are in Damascus.
Okay. So the family, what members of your family do you have here?
My father is here. My father's younger brother and younger sister and their extended families are here, and by extended families, I mean their children and their grandchildren. My father's eldest brother and my greatly extended family, meaning second cousins, third cousins, are still in Syria. My uncle and his children, who are my first cousins, and their children are still trapped in Syria. They've been trying to get here. Well, I say trapped. I shouldn't say trapped because they're not actually of refugee status at this point, but they have been in Syria, unable to come to the United States now for approximately 8 years.
That's very interesting. You gave me a real education before we came on the air about why it has taken so long for some of your family members, because they don't claim refugee status. And audience, if you have questions, please, the number is 340-1590. That's 340-1590. Give them a little explanation of that, Salima, if you'd be so kind.
Absolutely. It ironically wasn't until recently that I understood that there's a stigma associated with refugee status, with which my father, in particular, in my conversation with him, did not want to be associated. He when I asked him why our family simply didn't claim refugee status to see if the process could be expedited, he said, "We're not refugees." He said, "We can't do that. We're not refugees." And he was very taken aback. And it wasn't until after this conversation that I had with him that I realized that what he fears is the association of being a refugee in the eyes of citizens of the United States. I'm not sure if he feels like he would be discriminated against, or if he would think that it would make him seem as if he was taking something without giving back. And certainly that's not the case, because we support refugees. My family in New York State is sponsoring several families of refugee status. So that's not something that for which they should be ashamed. But I was just surprised to learn that today when speaking with him.
Yeah, I found that kind of interesting too. But that speaks to his strong pride in being an American citizen.
I would agree.
Yeah, one of the things that I really want my audience to understand is that there's so much effort involved in trying to get here. When people do get here, they take their commitment to being an American citizen very seriously.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and my audience needs to understand that, because there's some feeling that these people just come here to just gobble up our resources, when in fact, in some instances, it's a matter of life and death and providing a better opportunity for their children.
In most cases, what's happening, Rudy, is those who come here, whether they're coming as refugees or whether they are coming with the hopes of becoming permanent residents and hopefully eventually citizens, you're absolutely right. They are coming here to find a better life for their children. You have the ones who are coming here in order to escape the atrocities that are currently occurring in Syria, with the hopes of one day returning to Syria. But it's very important to understand we're not talking about citizens who are coming here with the goal of sitting back and collecting funds from taxpayer dollars, soaking up welfare and food stamps. There may be some who in the beginning rely upon something of that nature as they become acclimated, as they meet people, as they learn the language. And a lot of them, when they come here, will already speak a fairly good deal of English. But it's going to take them a little bit of time to get on their feet and get established. But we're not talking about culturally a group of people who are looking to take advantage of a system. We're talking about as you pointed out yourself, very prideful people who take a lot of pride in working hard and providing for their families. We come from a culture that lives in a lot of extended family situations, and not necessarily all in the same house, in some situations even in the same house, but not necessarily so. A lot of the times you'll find families of brothers and sisters who have purchased an entire street of homes so they can all still be close to one another because they value that family, that working family system. But they're not coming here to try to take advantage. They're coming here to be productive members, and I think we talked about this before, of the rich tapestry that is the United States of America, and they want to be contributing members of that society.
That's a beautiful thing. Now, I want my audience to understand the point that you're making. You have deeply ingrained family values. That's part of your culture.
Precisely.
Yeah. So, and that used to be a very important part of our culture. I'm not sure that it's as strong as it used to be, but they used to be a very strong part of our culture. And again, that number is 340-1590. If you have a question for Salima, please feel free to call. Salima, one of the things that you might be able to help us with, to educate my audience, can you explain for us what the difference is between a Shiite and a Sunni Muslim?
I can do my best. I just want to preface what I'm going to share with you with. I'm not a poli-sci expert. I'm not an historian, but I soak up everything I can. I read. I talk to people. I try to get many different perspectives, and the very basics about the differences between the Sunni and the Shia go all the way back to Muhammad. And upon the death of Muhammad, there was a disagreement between the two factions. And at the time, they weren't really factions, but that divided them and created the factions. And it was all about who was going to lead them upon the death of Muhammad. The Sunnis, we have approximately almost 2 billion Muslims in the world, maybe 1.5 billion, and 85% of those are Sunni.
Mm-hmm.
And historically, the United States has been allied with the higher population of Sunni Middle Eastern countries, and those would be, for example, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. Now, the Shiites are not as conservative as the Sunni, and the Shia are found predominantly in the Levant, or what's called the Shia Crescent, and that is Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. And in Syria, they break the Sunni down further into another sect called the Alawis, or the Alawites. And President Bashir Assad is an Alawite.
Mm.
Now, the problem that this causes is that 40% of all Sunnis don't even regard Shiites as Muslims, which is why when you have the radicalized Sunnis who do go on to commit terrorist acts, that the vast majority of their victims are fellow Muslims because they don't recognize them as Muslims.
Let me stop you right there,
yes.
because you just said something really important that I want my audience to understand.
Absolutely.
We are very concerned about terrorism, and rightfully so. But the majority of the people that have been killed by terrorist attacks are Islamic people.
That's correct. Probably 99% of, if not more, of all of the victims of today's terrorist factions have been fellow Muslims. And I'll be very honest with you. I don't want to take a political stance because I'm claiming neither Republican nor Democratic affiliation, but I believe that is probably one of the reasons that our current leader, President Obama, has not addressed the terrorism that we've been encountering as Muslim. I believe that's why he hesitates to do that. He doesn't want to put that label on the terrorists because of the implications for the huge remainder of Muslims and followers of Islam who are not violent and who are actually victims of these violent terrorists themselves.
I think you're absolutely right, and I happen to agree with him. That because I believe in the amount of suffering that Muslims have had to face from terrorism, I want to believe, maybe I'm naive, that if people are in a position to deal with somebody that is a terrorist in their community, even if it is a Muslim, I think they would turn them in.
Yes, they would, absolutely. If they were aware that someone was a terrorist, they would turn them in. The situation in Aleppo being the exception, in that they are being controlled by the movements of the terrorist factions, and these people in Aleppo are prisoners of their own homes. They are unable to leave because there are landmines and all kinds of treacherous paths on the way to freedom that pretty much are going to guarantee that they're not going to make it. We see the horrors of Aleppo every night on the evening news, and I have yet to become immune to it. I sit and cry and watch the news every night because I see these people, and when I see these victims, I see my brother, my father, my sister. These are people with whom I can identify, and I understand that not everyone does that. But and we hear all kinds of things about Assad and how awful he is and what a monster he is for what he's doing to Aleppo. But we see a very one-sided view.
But you know what? Let's get to that, because what I'd like to talk about now, maybe we ought to take a little break. And when we come back, what I want to talk about from your perspective, since you have kind of the inside track, I'd like to know what was the springboard that started this conflict, and you can educate me and my audience about what you know of that. So, folks, don't touch that dial. We're going to take a break, and we're going to be right back. And if you want to call in and talk to my guest, Sulima, that number is 340-1590. That's 340-1590.
Back to the African American scene in 2 minutes. We now return to the African American scene, brought to you by Howard Insurance in Port St. Lucie. Once again, here's your host, Rudy Howard.
And if you're just tuning in, shame on you if you're just tuning in. I have a guest tonight, and my guest is Sulima Abdulki. And her family is originally from Syria. So tonight we're talking a little about Syria, and she's given us some awfully good insight since she's have many family members that are from there. So Sulima, before we took a break, and again, if that you want to talk to her, that number is 340-1590. I wanted you to give us some insight into how we got to where we are with Bashar al-Assad and the rebels.
Absolutely. Of course, it's a very twisted and tangled web over in the Middle East, and it actually goes back much further then we probably have time to go. And if we have time, I would like to explain a little bit about Wahhabism and its influence on what's happening in Syria and in Iraq and now also in Yemen.
Please, go ahead. I want you to explain it. Yes.
Okay, absolutely. Then let's go ahead and I'll take it on back to Wahhabism.
Okay.
For those who are not familiar, Wahhabism is it is a Sunni sect of Islam, and it was begun in the 18th century in Saudi Arabia. There was a gentleman by the name of Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, and he formed an alliance with the leader of what became Saudi Arabia at the time, promising that the reformations and the proposals that he had for the practice of Islam would result in what he called political obedience. And he did this by taking away civil rights and liberties of citizens, and by making them sacrilegious, and taking the Quran quite literally, which, as we know with any type of literature, including the Quran or the Bible, if you take it too literally, you can tend to veer off in directions that were not intended by the writers. After the lifting of the oil embargo in the 1970s, Wahhabism exploded. And it's now being spread. It's spread through the funding of Saudi schools all over the world, and you'll hear them referred to as madrasas. But I cannot stress the importance of understanding enough that madrasa is simply the Arabic word for school.
I've seen something about that on 60 Minutes a couple years ago. Which was really eye-opening. But go ahead.
Yes, so it's very important when we are discussing some of these things to understand that a lot of these are just the Arabic word for a particular object, and madrasa is simply school. But when you hear them referred to as madrasas, it does not necessarily mean that they're teaching Wahhabism. I do just want to clarify that.
Okay.
But you have these schools and these mosques popping up all over the world, including right here in the United States. And this is why it's very important to understand Wahhabism and the role that it's playing in terrorism. So this influence of Wahhabism from the Saudis is gathering strength. And we talked a little bit about the difference between the Sunni and the Shia. And as you can imagine, in Middle Eastern countries where you have the Sunni and the Shia coexisting, not necessarily peacefully.
That's for sure.
For example, in Iraq, we had what was during Saddam Hussein, we had what was a predominantly Shia population governed by the minority Sunni leader of Saddam Hussein.
Correct.
And that's, of course, as you know, Rudy, I know you know, that's where the conflict arose.
Yeah.
In Iraq. Ironically, it was during the conflict between Iraq and Iran that the United States, amongst some others, assisted in the rise of the political power of Saddam Hussein in order to counteract the the Shia influence of Iran. So it gets, the more you learn, the more complicated it feels sometimes. So when the balance of power was tipped in Iraq, upon the fall of Saddam Hussein, what happened was the Shia, the majority Shia, then took over governing the state of Iraq, which then made the Sunni the oppressed. And what we had was these very angry, very disenfranchised Sunni now who are quietly forming what eventually came to be known as ISIS. Now jump over to Syria. In Syria, there's unrest between the majority Sunni population and the minority Shia Alawite leader Okay, so it's just the opposite as Iraq. And you had what began as very peaceful protests, young professionals, college students rising up and requesting a democracy. And during these peaceful protests, there was a horrible catalyst that really set the ball in motion, and that was the death of a little boy, 13-year-old Hamza Ali al-Khatib. He was, and it's even difficult for me to talk about even now. This was, I don't even know how many years ago, 7, 8 years ago, but he was butchered, beaten, burned, mutilated, and killed. And when his body was finally given back to his family, they went directly to the media. And Al Jazeera was just starting out worldwide at that time. And they made public the pictures of this young boy's body and what had happened with him. He had simply been out protesting with some of his peers and some of the young people of his village, and he disappeared, and it's suspected that the Air Force intelligence is responsible for his death, and they have a very, very infamous reputation for being very brutal. Assad ordered an investigation into his death and ordered severe punishment for the murderers of the young boy, of Hamza. But nothing has come of that, and I don't think many people really expected anything to come of that. But this was the catalyst that started the violence. And during that violence, once there were actual physical skirmishes and clashes, you had the radical Islamists who were in Iraq, the disenfranchised Sunnis, able to slip in to Syria and ally or appear to ally themselves with the rebels. And this is how ISIS came into Syria. So now we have so many factions and so many groups that are fighting for their own causes that it's complete and utter chaos.
You know, I knew that because I do a lot of reading like you. I don't think people realize how chaotic that situation is. And we created, when we took over Iraq and we fired all the police officers and all the military summarily, which was one of the dumbest things that I think we have ever done in the history of this country, we automatically radicalized those people who had those jobs. Now they have no job. They were productive citizens of Iraq, even if they were Sunni. We fired them all, and so along comes an opportunity to have a little payback. So it seems to me pretty logical.
You're absolutely right, Rudy. It was a big shakeup for them. You're precise, whether they're Sunni or not. They were living their lives normally for them one day, and the next day their lives had been turned upside down. Why? Because of something that was predicated on, for all intents and purposes, a rumor. And they are, rightfully or wrongfully, and in my opinion, I believe they have the right to be upset. You have a group of very upset, disenfranchised people. I don't know what the solution would have been. It seems that there could have been some solutions, but I wouldn't. I couldn't even pretend to say that I would have the answers for that.
I think I can say. I think you would have had to make a transitional situation to summarily dismiss the Army and the police force was just plain stupid. Now, there's going to maybe be some people out there listening that want to challenge me on that, but that is one of the stupidest things I think we've ever done as a country. Because what we did is we turned our military into the police department. And there was no basic authority on the cities and streets of Iraq. So if we had set up a transition where we had worked with those in power, some of them would have had to go. I understand that. But you don't throw them all out, because that just makes absolutely no sense at all. So, but anyway, so continue on with what you're saying. And so these guys now, but again, I want people to understand why our president has been so reluctant to intervene, because it's a jumbled mess. I'm so glad you said that. People don't really understand how messy this whole thing is.
It really is. It's even for someone like myself, and I spend a lot of time studying the history. I spend a lot of time studying current political science over there. I spend a lot of time in communications with people who are still in Aleppo, who are still in Yemen, who are on the front line of everything that is happening. It's horribly confusing, and it's almost like trying to read Jabberwocky from Alice in Wonderland. The more you read and think you understand, the more you realize how confused you really are. But the problem that we're experiencing now, and you hear about the American weapons that were given to the rebels that have ended up in the hands of ISIS. That was for those of us who were aware of what was happening, that was such a foreseeable outcome. Every time Angelina Jolie got up to champion the cause of the rebels, and I'm not saying the rebels don't have a cause, but every time she got up to champion their cause blindly, I just wrung my hands. I thought, oh my gosh, she doesn't know what she's saying, because she doesn't understand the dynamics of the politics there.
I don't think many people do. McCain was another one that was screaming and hollering to give the rebels arms, And the president, as he always does, is traveling the path of cautious, probably sometime too cautious, but he's trying to figure out what the heck is going on here before I make a move.
Yes, and it's a good thing that he is, because if we look into our crystal ball at the big picture, what has happened now is with some of these rebel factions have formed several coalitions. There's one known as the Islamic Front, and it was formed from 7 Islamic groups, and their goal, as they have stated it, is to topple the Assad regime completely and build an Islamic state. Well, that in and of itself shouldn't be daunting, but when you take into consideration that these are Sunni Muslims, a lot of whom are backed by Saudis, who are of the Wahhabist movement and who are prone to the violence because they are intolerant of others who are not Wahhabists, it is very intimidating. And we continue to ally ourselves with the Saudis, and we continue to provide them with arms and weaponry. I think we signed recently an agreement to supply them with $1.15 billion in weaponry. And these are people who have been accused of war crimes, specifically right now in Yemen, where the same thing that's happening in Syria is beginning to happen in Yemen. Let me back up, though, to Syria again. We have a lot of propaganda going on in this country from our media, from what's being presented to us by the rebels and some of the rebel factions. And I want to ask people to exercise caution when watching and reading about these things that are happening, for example, in Aleppo specifically, because that ancient city has been crushed. But In Aleppo, for example, you have East and West Aleppo. The East, with about 1 million, a population of 1 million, is controlled by Assad and the regime.
Yeah.
The west of Aleppo, or I'm sorry, the west is Assad controlled. The east are the rebels, and they have approximately 300,000 in population. And what you're seeing when you see the skirmishes in Aleppo are both sides, the factions from both sides being attacked, the factions from both sides under siege. It's not just Assad wreaking havoc and non-discriminately attacking civilians. And the civilians are being used by the rebels as propaganda. It's very treacherous for the civilians to try to escape. There was, about a month ago, a corridor opened for civilians, and only, I think I've read, about 200 people were brave enough to try to leave. ISIS has surrounded the area in landmines. It's physically dangerous to try to leave. There are snipers who shoot people if they try to leave. And the reason is because if in Assad's defense, what he considers to be his defense of his country from these rebels, he kills civilians, and they can put that on television, and we can get upset about it, and we can get angry about it. They feel like they will have our support. And Rudy, I think this is why our president is very hesitant to get involved. Yes, he sees what's happening on the television. Yes, he sees the media that we're all seeing, but he also understands that Assad is trying to do what's best to protect his country, and not just Sunnis, because the vast majority of the army that are Assad's regime are made up of Sunnis, and not just the Shia Alawites, but the Christians as well. He has been a protector of the Christians since the beginning of this civil war.
Well, I don't think many people understood that at all, that he has actually protected the Christians.
Yes. And I don't necessarily agree wholeheartedly with my family, but my family, for the most part, they are huge supporters of Assad. He has gone out of his way to ensure that the Christians continue to have a place in Syria from the beginning of taking control politically in Syria from his father. Again, I don't necessarily agree with them, and I don't necessarily agree with everything that he does, but he is a leader, and he does what he thinks is best for his country.
Yes, but here's the area where I see some concern. He used chemical weapons on his own people, women and children, and I get what you're saying, but I don't get that. Why would you do that?
I don't understand that either. And I'm going to assume it's true, and assuming that it's true, I don't understand. I don't know if he felt like he didn't have another option. I don't know tactically why that would be done, and I certainly can't defend it.
Something else I talked about on the show a few weeks back. The Russians have had a relationship with Syria going back to the 1950s. There's been this relationship with Syria, and in fact, they have a port in Syria that has Russian ships in there, and Russia has some business in Syria. Can you speak on that relationship?
You are correct. They've been allied for quite some time. Russia has tended to ally itself historically with those Muslims who are Shiite. For example, they're allied with Iran. They're allied with some of the Yemeni. I don't know how this relationship began. Like most political relationships, probably it is the whole strategic course of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and therefore when we allied ourselves with Saudi Arabia and Egypt, they probably felt like the best thing for them to do was to start making nice with some of the Shia-ruled nations of the Middle East. But it's interesting that you ask about that because it brings up Iran, the situation with Iran right now. We have so many people questioning what is Obama thinking by forgiving Iran and returning the funds that have been held from them, and what is he thinking by making the nuclear pact and the sitting down and breaking bread with them. I truly, truly believe the man is smarter than we give him credit for, and I think he sees the handwriting on the wall regarding the situation with extremists from the Middle East, or I should say Muslim extremists who are following the Wahhabist bent. And he's trying to get some type of alliance with those who are not Sunni, so that we do have some strength behind us. I don't know if that makes sense. If you watch, there's a YouTube video, and you can Google it, and it's I believe it's Congressman Johnson questioning the previous Syrian ambassador about the Wahhabist influence on terrorism, and it's very enlightening.
Well, I would tell you that. Well, first of all, I just really got to get this straight because Republicans really distort this message. President Obama did not give them any money. He released money that we had tied up for like 20 years.
Right.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that my audience hears that because you hear the statement, he gave them $400 million. No, he did not give them $400 million. He released money that belonged to them based on the fact that they're trying to have some dialogue for peace. Now,
that's correct.
Now, see, I'm going to agree with you. I think Obama's a whole lot smarter than people give him credit for, President Obama. If you are going to try to make a headway, first you got to talk. If you don't talk, the only thing you can do is fight. So if I see a guy and I know he and I got a beef, if I don't talk to him, there's only one thing I can do for us to settle the beef. We got to have a fight. But if I can have some dialogue with him, maybe we can avoid the fight. If we can find some common ground upon which to come to some kind of agreement. Now, there are people who are listening to me right now going, he's just weak and feckless and it was stupid. No, that's how you look at it. But the way I look at it is when we offer up our sons and daughters to go to foreign shores for our freedoms, I want to be damn sure we're doing it for the right reason. And if there's any other way to try to solve the problem without sending our sons and daughters to foreign shores, I sure want to explore it. And for those of you that are listening that think I am a dove, what I say to you is, let's insert the draft. If you feel like that, I'll go along with you, but I want everybody drafted. Let's put the draft back in like it was when I was in high school, and all of your sons and daughters are at risk to have to go serve. You do that, I'm with you. But anyway, I got on my soapbox there, Salima, for a second.
You're fine, Rudy.
Yeah.
I cannot express how important it is for us to understand in our ever-shrinking world and our ever-growing population to understand the dynamics of what is happening in the Middle East right now. I recently was reading an article, and they quoted an Aleppo resident, and he said, and I'm quoting him here, "Unfortunately, our lives have become cards in the hands of international players who are preventing an end to the war in Syria. As a citizen, all I want right now is some water and electricity."
Very good. I got a caller for us, and we got Frank on line 2. Yes, Frank.
Yes, Rudy, yes. I just a quick comment because it's near the end of the show. Common ground is only common ground when there's enough room on your side and enough room on the other side to both put a position in the middle.
So what? I don't understand what you're saying.
Okay. To have common ground where your position is, you're going to have to move to the right.
I have to move to the right?
Because your position is on the left. Okay? When you want common ground where you are. You want us to agree on the right with you on the left. That's common ground. That's not how it works.
Okay. Well, when I say common ground, what I'm saying is, if like I said, if I have a beef with a guy, okay, if we can't have a dialogue, Frank, there's only one way to solve that beef. We got to have a fight.
Or an election.
Yes, okay, all right, or an election, or an election. But if I can have a conversation, there's a chance, if we have reasonable minds, that we can come to some common understanding and resolve it without the fight.
I've got a quotation for you that I'm sure you're going to find humorous. It comes from William F. Buckley. He said, "My friends on the left always advocate listening to other positions, comma, but then they're shocked when they discover there are other positions."
Oh, well, I don't think so. Listen,
really?
If you've listened to me for a long time, Frank, I have said one thing, and I say it over and over and over again. If you give me a position and I can't defend that which I am stating, I am obligated to rethink it. I am obligated to rethink it, and I will rethink it. If I present an argument or a position and I can't defend it based on something that you're saying or somebody else is saying, I'm going to rethink that position.
All right, but here's the thing. You can't use CNN, MSNBC, so on, ABC, NBC News, CBS. You can't use the leftist media for your talking points. You can't do that. You've got to find true objective facts, not the leftist talking points.
Okay, well, thank you, Frank, for calling.
That's why we have elections.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Well, when you've got a guest on your show whose family is in Syria,
yeah,
I would tend to want to hear that, because we're going to hear probably any media could be one-sided. It could be either-sided. But when you hear it from somebody who's concerned about their own family being over there, I think it's worth our ears.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So, Selena, I'm not sure where we left off, but we were trying to get to the bottom of, and you've been absolutely a phenomenal guest. And it
has been a pleasure.
And you have provided us with lots of information, and we're down to about 3 minutes? So, and guess what? Aren't you surprised it went by so fast and you were all nervous? And it was nothing.
It did. It did go by way too quickly.
I know.
It seems like there's so much more information I would like people to know and to understand. And Rudy, I'll tell you, it's important to me because there are elections coming up, and we are getting ready to vote for someone who is going to lead this great nation. And it's so important for us to understand the facts, because if we don't know them, if we don't know the facts and what's really happening, then how in the world can we judge whether those people whom we are putting into office to lead us also know those facts?
That is so true. And you know what? Let me tell you, I'm old enough to remember before there was an internet, if you wanted to find something out, you had to go sit in the library or get the encyclopedias to sit on the floor and open up the encyclopedias to try to find an answer. Now
I had 3 sets.
You had 3 sets. I had 2. Now you can go to the internet and do your due diligence and get an answer on something in a couple of minutes.
Absolutely. And I say, read what the left is saying, but read what the right is saying. Read what disinterested parties are saying, because somehow they're still managed to be disinterested parties. But take it all in. You have intellect. You have judgment. You're able to determine that the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
And we can communicate with people in every country now if we choose to. It's just a matter of reaching out and saying, hey, tell me about this.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, I'm going to have you back, because I know we didn't cover enough territory. And I got guests coming on for the next couple of weeks. But I promise you, Salima, if you give me the time, I'm going to have you back, and we'll talk some more.
I would consider it a privilege, Rudy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Folks, thank you for listening to the African American Scene. I hope I gave you a full-bore education tonight. God bless and be safe, and I'll see you next Wednesday right here for the African American Scene.
The African American Scene, a special feature on Wednesday nights from Howard Insurance in Port St. Lucie. This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.